Just about anything can be freeze-dried with a few exceptions. Foods high in oils and foods high in sugars. Those are a little bit more difficult to freeze-dry. Well, then you have the category of breads. Breads can be freeze-dried really easy, but trying to bring them back to life without having them get soggy, that is difficult, if not impossible. So I thought, well, instead of trying to freeze-dry bread, how about freeze-drying bread dough and then using the bread dough to bring it back to life. So I have some bread dough here. This is actually for crescent rolls, and I make pretty good crescent rolls. This is a classic Betty Crocker crescent roll recipe. So what we're going to do, I'm going to knead this dough, and once this dough is done, I'm going to divide it into 4 parts. I'm going to freeze dry it, and then we're going to try to bring it back to life. Now, the thing inside, well, 2 things make good dough. One is the amount of gluten that's going to be in the dough itself. The gluten is what makes dough have the ability to make those really nice little air bubbles inside. Gluten is like the elasticity that holds the bread together as the yeast produces carbon dioxide. Well, I know that you can put yeast in the freezer, and you can freeze yeast and you can use it after it's been frozen. But what I haven't figured out is what happens to yeast under a very high vacuum. Will the high vacuum kill the yeast? So, in the 4 pieces we're going to make, I'm going to try to see if I can just bring back the freeze-dried dough just how it is and make crescent rolls. And I'm going to leave some 1/4 of this aside and re-add the yeast to see if the freeze-dry process will kill the yeast or not. And then I'm going to try bringing it back with and without kneading to see if the elasticity in this dough will stay or will it also be destroyed through the freeze-dry process. So I haven't kneaded this dough much at all. It's basically to the point where everything is bound together. So we're going to take this, divide it in 4 pieces. Half will be kneaded, half will not be kneaded, and then out of those 2, we'll see what happens. If the freeze dryer destroys yeast, I'm going to put one of these in dry. I'm going to go ahead and mix this one up with some water. I'm going to freeze dry these and then reconstitute them in my next batch of crescent rolls. We just want to see if putting this into water is going to make any difference, whether or not the yeast can survive the freezing process. So we're going to mix this up, and we're going to pre-freeze it, and then we're going to put it in to the freeze dryer. This is my 3rd batch of dough I've done in the freeze dryer. Previously, I thought that the big huge air pockets that you see here were from the yeast activating sometime during the freeze dry cycle. But that's not the case, because on this particular batch of dough I did not add any yeast at all. So these big fat bubbles that we see here is just from the freeze drying process. Now, along with the dough, I had 2 containers of yeast in the freeze dryer. This is right out of the package. I put it in dry and it hasn't changed much. This yeast was the same amount as this yeast, but I mixed this with water and then freeze dried it. That's why it looks a little bit different, more like a dried mud. So I'm going to split the yeast between these two. This one right here was kneaded. This dough right here was not kneaded. This dough right here was kneaded, and this dough right here is not kneaded. So I'm going to split the yeast between the two. I'm going to put this dough into the food processor and grind it up into a powder. So it's going to be easier to mix the yeast and the moisture back into it. Each of these trays started at 271 grams, and we're going to be putting 68 grams of water and yeast back into the dough to rehydrate it. All my freeze-dried dough has been reconstituted with moisture and yeast. So this is the dough that was kneaded with regular dry yeast, not kneaded with regular dry yeast, kneaded with wet yeast, and not kneaded with wet yeast. So these are the rolls that just barely came out of the oven. So both of these used the wet yeast that went through the freeze dryer. And I think what has happened, these things did not glaze hardly at all. They're hard, they're not very airy. There's very little structure and yeast bubbles in there. And I'm pretty sure with this result that the freeze dryer killed all the yeast off. Now this is where I had the yeast that was mixed up with water, and I put the container in the freeze dryer. And I think that process killed everything, so the yeast just didn't do anything. And that's even when I had the final dry set at 90 degrees. So this was very disappointing. These are basically hockey pucks. What was more promising was the dough that I made that didn't contain any yeast. And the yeast I put into the freeze dryer was the dry powdered yeast. There was no water in the yeast. And it looks like that yeast survived. So this is the dough that was not kneaded, and this was the dough that was kneaded. Now, I did some research about these little goosebumps on the rolls, and from my research, what I found out that gluten is not water soluble. So there's a good chance that any of the gluten structure that developed in the dough prior to freeze drying and then went through the freeze drying cycle, all those little bits and pieces, once it became elastic, the water, when I tried to rehydrate it, would not flow into that gluten. So it made all those little pop marks that looked like sesame seeds. Now, however, it did rise. I mean, some of these are pretty decent size, so the yeast did work, but it's not real appetizing to see all these little marks all over the rolls. Now, the dough that wasn't kneaded, that I used regular yeast, this was a lot better. I mean, some of these came unfolded, but these came out to be really, really nice. These rolls twice the size of the ones I did, and there's a lot of air pockets in there. They're quite fluffy, so these came out to be really, really good. If you're going to freeze dry dough, you need to protect the yeast. Normally, the preset functions for the final dry is around 125 degrees. If you're going to freeze dry dough, you need to drop the temperature so you don't kill the yeast, since the yeast will die at 120 degrees. Go into customize, catching that over there we go, down to about 190. Now, as the sign says, it will improve the appearance of the food, and it's going to increase your dry time. So you might want to consider not adding the yeast prior to freeze drying, but adding the yeast after the fact. I've done this experiment so many times that I already know that each tray basically lost 64 grams of water. So I'm going to add 64 grams of warm water back into each of these bowls, but 2 of these bowls will have the yeast added back in. So this bowl, I'm going to add yeast to this one, I'm going to add yeast to this one. These 2 bowls already had yeast added to them. And I've also, it's not, strictly science, it's going to be 64 grams, because I've noticed in the past sometimes I have to add a little bit more water. So I'm going to let this yeast just kind of percolate here for a while, dissolve itself before we add it in to the dough. I'm going to take the no yeast, no knead mix first, and we're going to add the yeast back into this, and we'll have the food processor do the mixing for me. So we're going to go through all our bowls and add the moisture back in. And the first sensation you have is this dough feels gritty. And so it's going to take a few moments for the moisture to reconstitute this dough. But we're going to go ahead and go through all the bowls and get them back into a dough state. All the dough has been reconstituted. The next step we're going to do, we're going to knead the dough. That will help the moisture in the dough and the little particles mix back together again. These 2 were kneaded prior to freeze drying. These were not, but we're going to knead all the dough the same amount prior to rolling out our rolls and baking them. I'm kneading this dough back into shape, and there's been a couple of times where I just took this ball of dough and just ran it under a little bit of water to make it more wet and more sticky, because as I'm kneading this dough, more water is going into the dry particles and it's being absorbed, and so the dough has dried out a little bit, and so I've been having to add more water to it to keep it in a dough consistency. So we're almost done kneading the dough, and then we're going to roll it out and discuss some of the problems about adding yeast and kneading the dough prior to freeze drying. Time to roll out the dough. So we're going to start with the dough that had yeast but was not kneaded, but the dough is now kneaded. About that size. I'm sure most people know how to make crescent rolls, so I'm just going to do this just once so you can kind of get the gist, just in case someone has never made a crescent roll, but they're my favorite. And like I said, this is an old Betty Crocker recipe. So we're going to cut these in 6. So I have the oven just preheating to a nice warm temperature. Now another good thing about the Harvest Right trays, you can also bake with them. So we're going to go ahead and put our crescent rolls back in the Harvest Right tray. We'll cover them with some plastic wrap. Put them in a nice warm place. Always just heat up an oven, turn off the oven so it's nice and warm inside, and use that to raise the dough. And then I'll be baking these at 375 degrees for about 10 minutes, I believe it is. So we're going to do this 4 more times with all of our different doughs and put them in the oven to raise them. I'm about ready to put these into the oven. I just want to show you how they went. So this tray right here was no yeast, no knead. There's the oven now. So these came out looking really good. I mean, I'm very happy with these. This tray had no yeast, but the dough was kneaded before freeze drying. And you can see these little marks around the dough, which I believe are gluten fragments that once the gluten was formed in the dough and the water was added back to the dough, the gluten would not absorb that water. This is yeast was added and kneaded prior to freeze drying. These just raised just a little bit, and even though I turned the final dry down to 95 degrees, it looks to me that a lot of the yeast was killed through the freeze drying process. I have more to explain about that. And this is about the same problem. The yeast just is not doing much. So yeast and freeze drying is a difficult thing. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and put these in the oven now, and they'll be done soon. The rolls are fresh out of the oven and have basically 2 different categories of success. So the 2 trays that had yeast added to the dough prior to freeze drying did not, I mean, they rose a bit, but not as much as these 2 trays that had the yeast added after freeze drying. The other issue is the kneading. So, for example, if you take a look at this roll, I mean, if you open it up, I mean it's nice and airy, good air pockets inside, but you can kind of see these little blemishes around the outside of the roll, and I'm pretty sure that those blemishes are pieces of gluten that was developed prior to freeze drying, and then when we tried to reconstitute the dough, because the gluten is this elastic material, it would not take up any water. Where, you know, you look at this, I mean, this is a great one. This is one of the ones that we did not need prior to freeze drying, and we added the yeast. This is probably, I mean, the absolute best roll right there. I mean, nice air pockets, nice structure inside that one. This one right here also has these little imperfections from the gluten. I mean, it's still good. I mean, I'd serve any of these rolls with dinner, but these rolls just look a lot better, and they're more fluffy than these rolls. Taste is just fine. So, in conclusion, this is about the 12th batch I've done. If you're going to freeze dry dough, my suggestion is this: do not put yeast in the dough prior to freeze drying, because freeze drying is not kind to yeast. One thing, you need to turn down the temperature on your final dry down to around 85-90, because if the final dry gets above 120, it will kill your yeast. Another thing I've learned is that you can freeze dry yeast as long as the yeast is dry. If you make the yeast wet and then try to freeze dry it, the moisture, I believe, activates the yeast. It becomes alive. You freeze dry it, and the moist yeast is pulled apart by the vacuum forces and kills the yeast. Don't add yeast, and don't knead the dough prior to freeze drying. Add the yeast after the fact, and you'll have better results. I hope you enjoyed this video. I would love to hear your comments, and please subscribe and give me a like, and we'll continue on this venture.